In this week's news, Apple's iPhone 6s surpasses all sales expectations once again, our own Google Rumor Roundup, and Elephone unveils the dual-booting Vowney smartphone.
All this and more on this week's episode of Bandwidth Blog On Air. Welcome to episode 12.
Welcome to Bandwidth Blog On Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.
Apple CEO Tim Cook announced on Monday that Apple has surpassed all of their previous sales records when it comes to the sales of the new iPhone 6s and 6s Plus. Now, this is, of course, in only the first weekend sales, the opening weekend sales. And previously, with the release of the iPhone 6, Apple actually sold 10 million units in the first weekend, whereas now with the iPhone 6s, they've sold 13 million. Now, I don't know about you, Brian, but I can't believe that 13 million people went out to buy this on launch date or on the launch weekend. I mean, it's not like a brand new movie coming out. You can still buy this phone at any time. What do you think about that?
Well, in all honesty, I absolutely can't believe it either. I find it's actually stupendous how now in 2015, now we're technically on the 9th iPhone, and arguably, at least externally, which I think is what a lot of people will notice first, is the iPhone hasn't changed that much. I think the biggest innovation really Apple has brought to the iPhone with the 6s is 3D Touch, which was Force Touch originally. I think that's a great feature to bring to the iPhone because it really refreshes the home screen with all those apps, and I think that's something that's been looking stagnant for a really, really long time. The downside being obviously that Apple are going to have to produce all new iOS devices, so new iPads basically, to be able to support that technology, which is going to be a bummer for everyone else stuck with the more basic now version of iOS 9. You're not going to be able to benefit from, who aren't going to be able to benefit from 3D Touch technology. Even, that being said, I don't understand how that sales figure is justified. I can't believe that even, let's say, a reasonable fraction of those 13 million people actually camped outside Apple stores. And I mean, we see this almost every year when Apple bring out a new iPhone, and the hype train is definitely still going. It's amazing even that, the iPad doesn't even attract that kind of attention when a new model comes out. And speaking of the iPad, it's going to be interesting where exactly the iPad Pro is going to go, because I don't particularly see a really sizey, acute market that being marketed to. I think maybe see it in education. Maybe teachers will start to use that as their primary model, and then students in classes will use their general tablets, iPads or Android tablets or Windows tablets. But again, I don't really see that an acute market for that. And it's still frankly amazing that even that, the iPad Pro, which I think is a really interesting product, hasn't generated as much interest as a new iPhone has.
Just to touch on your point there, I think a lot of those 13 million people did actually stand in line and camped outside of the Apple stores for their devices. And just to put that into perspective, it means that Apple sold $10 billion worth of iPhones in basically 2.5 or 3 days, which is astonishing. Now, another interesting fact we've learned in the last couple of days is that the iPhone 6s might actually be water resistant. Now, don't go and take a shower with the device just yet. It's not officially water resistant, but a couple of reviewers have tested how water resistant it actually is, and they submerged a iPhone 6s and an iPhone 6s Plus in water for up to 60 minutes, and they both still worked, which is quite interesting, especially since these devices aren't being marketed as being water resistant.
I'm not sure how much of a conscious effort Apple actually put into ensuring that the iPhone 6 is really water resistant. But again, I find it interesting that they're not marketing it as such. I mean, I think first of all, I think Apple are trying to avoid another Ben Gate, in that they don't want people to start digging baths with their iPhones or jumping in the shower with it. But I think personally, I don't really find the idea of having a water-resistant smartphone that attractive at all, because I generally just try to keep my smartphone in my pocket. I keep it out of the elements as much as possible. I think being dust-proof is a great idea, and I think that's a great way to protect the more delicate internals of a smartphone. And I would probably more look at buying a smartphone if it were dust-resistant. But water resistance, my own smartphone, which is an Xperia Z1, is, and I can't tell you I've ever been tempted to sort of run it under tap water and see what happens. So I think it's an interesting trend. Whether Sony will respond to this by making a 4K water-resistant phone, we'll have to wait and see.
Some interesting news that's happened over the last couple of weeks that we haven't really spoken about yet is the announcement from Elephone that they're going to launch the Vowney smartphone. Now, as we said previously, it's going to be a dual booting smartphone. What exactly do we know about it, and what details do we have about operating systems that's going to be running on it?
All right, so the Vowney is slated to arrive in 2 different versions. The first is going to be a purely Android 5.0 Lollipop smartphone. So as generic as flagships comes, that's what it's going to be. But the second is going to arrive with the ability to dual boot between Windows 10 Mobile and Android 5.0 Lollipop. So the major differences between these 2 models, beyond the operating systems they support, is that the pure Android version will carry a 20.7 megapixel camera and a 3,800 milliamp hour battery, while the dual boot version is going to come with just a pure 20 megapixel camera and will sport a larger 4,200 millihour battery. So I imagine that's really to support the OS swapping that you're going to be able to do on that. I really think that's an interesting decision to put Windows 10 Mobile and Android together. I don't know how many people are really going to want to even swap between those, because, I mean, at the end of the day, there's not that much exclusive to Windows 10 Mobile as there is on Android, for instance. And obviously the Google Play Store, depending where you are, is far more thriving than the Windows Store presently. What are your thoughts, Theunis? Which operating system would you use more in your day-to-day?
Now, don't get me wrong, I really like Windows 10 Mobile. I haven't tested out that much, only kind of the beta releases. And obviously previously with Windows 8 Mobile, we did give it a good try on a couple of devices, and it is a really good operating system. On an everyday basis, I do prefer to use Android, mostly because of the customizability and the ease of access. But I do think it's an interesting idea to have both these operating systems on one device. I'm not quite sure where the target market would be, and we saw that when we broke the story, a lot of our readers said, why, where is this applicable? And I mean, we do share that sentiment. That being said, the weirdest thing to me, actually, the strangest part to me, actually, is the fact that the dual booting version has a different camera nodule than the pure Android version. Now, why would that be exactly? Do you think it's just because certain camera nodules don't work as good with Windows Phone, or what compromise did they have to make here?
Well, having not had the Vowney in my hand, to my mind, beyond the fact, like you've said, that I think there's probably some inconsistency between what Windows 10 Mobile and Android can support in terms of cameras, I think the largest compromise Elephone would probably have to make, to my mind, is size, because I think both models are at the same physical size. So to accommodate a larger battery, you're going to have to shuffle some of those internals around. And to my mind, I would imagine that you would have to sort of compromise somewhere to expand that space for that larger battery, and I think that's likely where the camera has suffered. We'll probably find out more about that as more details are released closer to the actual physical launch of the product. But that being said, I do think it's interesting, and I wonder if in-depth testing will pick up any major differences between those two, or whether they'll perform more closely to each other than we expect at the moment. To pick up on your earlier point, though, I think this is something which is interesting in that I actually wouldn't mind using Windows 10 as my daily driver. I mean, I have a Microsoft Surface myself, and I quite enjoy where Microsoft are going with the Windows 10 sort of ecosystem. And I think I have an Xbox One at home, so it would quite nicely integrate with all my devices. That being said, though, I'm not sure how much I would want to use OS switching. If I wanted a Windows 10 smartphone, I want a pure Windows 10 smartphone with no frills to accommodate another operating system. And that being said, I think, funnily enough, what comes to my mind is that this device is actually perfectly suited for reviewers. People like you and I who are going to go to review the latest apps on either platform. We will want a smartphone that can handle either operating system, and we'll be able to then check out the latest software builds as well as the latest apps on it. For a general audience, I don't quite know where Elephone are going beyond making a marketing splash with this, so I think we'll have to wait and see. So since we're on the subject of Android and flagships, we've had some major news from Google regarding the next 2 Nexus devices, as well as Android Marshmellow.
Well, actually, nothing is official yet. We're expecting the official announcements to happen today, which is the 29th of September. And what we will be getting from Google is the news of the Google Nexus 5X, the Google Nexus 6P, and then the new release of Android called Marshmellow. Now, what is very interesting about this year's Nexus devices is that we think that Google will be reverting to their previous model of having really affordable Nexus devices, still having really, really good specs in it. So up until the Nexus 5, we saw that Google had smartphone prices of well below $400 for a device that is really, top-notch in terms of spec and hardware. That all changed with the Motorola's. That all changed with the Nexus 6, which was built by Motorola, and it was very, very expensive, and I don't think it did that well. I also think that is why we'll have two Nexus devices this year, one at a more regular kind of 5.2 inch size, and then another phablet sized one in the 6P.
Since Google in essence are turning now to two Nexus smartphones, can we expect any major spec differences between both of them? Will one be a more high-performing contender, or both of them offering sort of different options at different prices?
Well, to answer that, let's quickly look at the rumored specs. Now, as I said, none of these are confirmed yet, and some of them are still a bit sketchy. But if we look at the Nexus 5X, which will be built by LG, we'll probably be seeing a 5.2-inch Full HD or a Quad HD display. We're not quite sure. It'll have a Snapdragon 808 processor, which is that hexa-core processor we saw on the LG G4. It'll have either 2 or 3 gigabytes of RAM. Now, we don't know if that's just uncertainty or if there'll be two variants. And it'll also have a 13 megapixel Sony sensor and a 2700 milliamp hour battery. Now, if you look at the Nexus 6P, which will be built by Huawei, we have a 5.7-inch Quad HD display that has been confirmed as definitely being Quad HD. It'll have a Snapdragon 810 processor, 3 gigabytes of RAM, and it'll have, strangely enough, a 11 megapixel rear camera and a 7 megapixel front-facing camera. Now, I think this is all still conjecture. I don't think these are confirmed, because that seems very strange to me. What do you think about these specs, Bryan, and what do you think we can expect from the devices?
I think the most interesting thing out of both of them is the differences between the cameras. Now, obviously, this isn't official nor confirmed, so we're working on speculation. But what seems to me what manufacturers are really going for, at least with sort of mid-tier smartphone bundles, is that they're trying to balance the front-facing camera with the rear. So what we're seeing manufacturers do is roll out quite hefty front-facing cameras, like in the case of this Nexus 6P, which will be a 7 megapixel, so we assume, and on the primary camera it'll be 11 megapixels, so it's much closer generally than most Android flagships at least offer at the moment. Now, it would seem to me that LG's Nexus, which is the 5X, would offer the superior shooter, because we know at least it has a Sony sensor, which generally is regarded as one of the best in the industry. And I think what we might see, which is a complete reversal of what a lot of manufacturers tend to do, is that the smaller Nexus 5X might be the primary model, while the phablet Huawei device might sacrifice its specs for a larger form factor. Where this is all going it's quite interesting, because we don't know yet where these devices are going to be priced, but it says something interesting if Google are working to bring down the price to revert to earlier sort of Nexus model prices. Where do you think these devices are going to be positioned, Theunis?
In terms of the specs, it is probably one of the most interesting years for Nexus devices, because yes, all of these hardware components have been available for quite some time, and it's nothing new or revolutionary. And I think that is just saying that Google is going to be pricing these devices very, very aggressively. It's probably going to be more or less in the $300 to $400 price range, which is squarely aimed at the mid-tier market. But I do think it'll be more competitive in terms of specs and pricing. Now, Bryan, of course, these being Nexus devices, both of them will be running stock Android. Do you think there's a big enough market for these devices in that not a lot of people really know stock Android that well? Do you think people will gravitate towards stock Android?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and it makes me recall something we've said on an earlier episode of Bandwidth Blog on Air when I reviewed the AG Mobile Ghost. And one of the things I bemoaned about it was the fact that it came with stock Android KitKat, which I said doesn't really offer an intuitive way to get to grips with the smartphone. What a lot of manufacturers do, and now let's use Samsung as our point and reference. Samsung load up their Android software with TouchWiz, which is their own skin. Now, love it or hate it. What TouchWiz does, it renders some of the more complex features of Android accessible and easier to get to, at least in terms of the user interface. That's something I found the AG Mobile lacked using stock Android. What we're going to see with these two new Nexus devices, that both of them are going to debut with Android 6.0 Marshmellow, which isn't really a major release over KitKat. It's more of a subtle improvement, if we're going to call it that. And the biggest improvement really is you're now going to get Google Now on tap throughout the device, as well as a few new options in your system menus. And I think for a while, until manufacturers start to release Marshmellow to their present or older devices, I think Nexus will at least have a little bit of a monopoly on that. It might attract some of the more tech enthused of us, but I think at the end of the day, it might still end up being a little bit too stark for a completely general audience beyond its price point. What I've liked about what Motorola do is that their skin takes a very, very simple approach on Android and doesn't bloat it with any unnecessary features. And I've always thought that that's the way to go, because it keeps the operating system clean, fresh, and usable, and as well it makes those more inaccessible features easy to get to.
Actually, I do think that the new release of Marshmellow will make a big difference with those gripes that you were talking about earlier. Some of these small little improvements did go a long way in improving usability to the normal customer. I think a lot of these software enhancements actually went into the way some of the menus are arranged, where you can find certain settings and those kind of things, which will make it more accessible to the normal person. I think Google really want to encourage manufacturers to not skin the hell out of Android every time they get the opportunity. So in that, they are trying to make Android as easy to use as possible, so that not a lot of people want to chop and change, add a lot of features. So I do think that Google is trying to make Android as accessible as possible, so that the manufacturers don't change too much, and that you'll have a consistent experience on any Android device, which is what Google has been going for since the beginning. Unfortunately, we had fragmentation, and the early builds of Android wasn't too stable, and some of them were ugly, and they had a host of problems at the beginning. I do think Google have kind of ironed out most of their problems with Android. There's obviously still a long way to go. I do think that they don't want to take the Apple route and say, this is what you have and you have no other choices. They do want to keep it in a way that people can, fiddle with it, play with it, and try to make it to their liking.
Well, that's all for this episode of Bandwidth Blog On Air. Thank you very much for joining us.
We just once again want to thank everyone that sent in their questions for us to answer. We got to a lot of them, but a lot of them we haven't answered yet. If we have time in future episodes, we might do so. But in the meantime, also send us other questions to editor@bandwidthblog.com, and we'll get to them as soon as possible. Join us next week for episode 13.
You've been listening to Bandwidth Blog On Air, the weekly podcast of bandwidthblog.com.